As we get closer to that season, we're going to want to decrease that volume of weight training and make the training that they are doing in the weight room more sport specific. And that's going to work kind of in concert with an increase in the volume of practice as they get closer to competition. So they're doing more and more of their sport, less and less in the weight room. And as we get to that point where they're about to start their season, we want the intensity of their work in the weight room to be very, very high. We want the volume to be very, very low.
It is the Lane United legend, Armando Field.
Welcome to FC Game Changer. We got game. The football club that will change your game.
Welcome back, everyone, to the FC Game Changer show. Today, Loren Trottmann is here with us. He's a certified strength and conditioning coach who specializes in athletic performance training. He's also a graduate of the University of Oregon with a bachelor's degree in psychology, and now he's a full-time doctor of physical therapy student at Oregon State University. Loren, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We're excited for this today. I think, with your background in strength and conditioning, now becoming a physical therapist, and your bachelor's degree in psychology, we have three pillars in our podcast on FC Game Changer. It's mindset, strength, and nutrition. Yeah. I think you're probably the first guest that we have that could encompass the three pillars.
Sure.
So this is should be good.
Cool. I'm excited.
Yeah. So let's kick this off with how did you start in strength training and why pursue physical therapy?
Yeah. It's kind of a two-part answer, of course. I think for me, I will be the first to admit that I was a really average athlete when I was in high school. And part of the reason for that is that nothing outside of what I was doing in sport was in order. So my strength training was virtually non-existent, and it wasn't productive, and my nutrition wasn't productive, and my sleep wasn't productive, none of those things. What ended up happening is I got some injuries, had 2 rotator cuff injuries, both sides, and at that point I was kind of starting to get into strength training a little bit, just to try to improve my performance. Wasn't doing anything very productive at the time. But what ended up happening is I kind of rehabbed myself accidentally from that, just through generally getting stronger. And I think that was kind of the moment where it started to click for me of like, oh, okay, like this is having a marked improvement on my condition and my capacity to compete. And so at that point I kind of started to realize like, okay, if I really start to learn about this and I start to be more diligent with how I'm training and all that, I can make a lot of improvements and maybe take myself from being that average athlete, right, and get my performance way up. And so yeah, that's how I kind of got into strength training. Over time, I ended up, I graduated from high school, I went to college, dove a lot more into it. Even though I was studying psychology, I was probably much more fascinated by the strength training side of it, human movement, biomechanics, all those things. And so I started learning about that on my own, training myself. Saw a lot more improvements from that. And so when I graduated from college, I initially wanted to go into sports psychology. And so that was kind of my long-term goal, which would have been a PhD. Right. And so I kind of had to have that decision point of what I was going to do. And so at that point, I wasn't so sure that I wanted to do that anymore. And so I went and I got a job at a sport performance facility in Southern Oregon. Started working with a lot of youth athletes, some soccer.
Nice.
And at that point, athletes get hurt, right?
Yeah.
And essentially I wanted the tools to be able to help those people more.
Yeah.
And so my long-term goal, even though my interest is definitely very much in performance, is that I want to be able to have the knowledge across the board. So all the way from the rehab side to the performance side, and be able to help those athletes through their entire journey, from coming back all the way to kind of their highest level of performance they can achieve. So yeah, that was a long answer, but
no, that's good. What's interesting that you said your strength training back then wasn't as productive.
Sure.
Right, and you mentioned you got injured, rotator cuffs, and all of that. Why do you think it wasn't as productive as you think it should? Was it lack of knowledge, lack of coaching? What was it?
So it was both. So when I was younger, I ran track and I wrestled. Those were my two sports predominantly. And the training that we received was just delivered by our coaches, right? We didn't have strength and conditioning coaches or anything of that nature.
The sports-specific coach, not a strength and conditioning coach.
Right, exactly. And it was fairly infrequent. So I wasn't getting a lot from that. And so what I ended up doing was trying to strike out on my own. But I was also 15, 16. And this was at a time when information was a little bit harder to get. So different than it is now, where there's a lot more qualified people in the space kind of talking to this audience. Back then, you know, I was on like bodybuilding.com forums and all that.
A lot of people talking a bunch of nonsense. Some people were probably good advice, but
Yeah, and it's hard to disseminate what is accurate and helpful versus what's not, especially at that age. And there's just so much content out there, and it's really hard to find repeatable sources. And so I guess to boil all that down, what ended up happening is my strength training basically looked like bodybuilding training, which is fine.
Yeah.
But a lot of athletes make that mistake where they're going so far that way and they're not training for their sport. And so they're training for like general hypertrophy goals, but that's not going to actually necessarily improve their performance. It might a little bit. They'll get stronger, they'll get a little bigger, all those things, but we're not making you any faster. We're not making you move better, all that stuff.
Yeah, and then you also mentioned the recovery, the sleep, the nutrition. Did that come with you researching yourself, or you had mentors to help you, get that knowledge about nutrition? Because I think we talked off camera on, let's say, high school. Let's target the soccer players, right?
Sure.
Or high school athletes. They are probably going to the gym, going to training, but they're not getting as much as they could because their nutrition is not on point.
Yeah.
So how did that work for you?
Yeah, so that's something that I definitely had to just research myself. It was kind of the same situation when I was that age, so I was 16, 17, 18. There still wasn't a lot of resources from reputable sources to find out kind of what I needed to do, and so I kind of had to put it all together from all these different places that I pulled.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest challenge for me back then, and I think this still applies to a lot of youth athletes, is I literally just didn't get enough food. I wasn't eating enough. And that happens a lot with kids because they're in school, right, all day. There's not necessarily adequate breaks or anything. And a lot of times at that age, we're not planning, We're not saying, I need to eat at 10 a.m. and I need to eat again at 3 p.m. to make sure I'm ready for practice and I have adequate carbohydrate intake and all those things. And so, I think that hindered my performance a lot. I think it still hinders kids a lot because we don't have the education and we don't have the structure built into the day in order for them to get that. I think that's a huge thing that parents can be more supportive with. And coaches
especially at
too.
that age.
Yeah,
and coaches too, you're right.
Yep.
You're right. So what could be, do you think it's lack of planning? Because they do have the information nowadays. They can do a quick search on Google. They can do a quick search on YouTube and find good sources for them to learn from.
Yep.
What is a piece of advice that you can give them that's like plan a little bit better or organize yourself a little bit better, that these things will make a huge difference in your athletic career in terms of strength training and nutrition? It's not just one. If they're doing one, it is already something that's going to improve their athletic performance. But if they're doing both, that's going to exponentially help them. So what is a piece of advice that you can give them that will help them in terms of strength and conditioning plus the nutrition piece? Yeah,
I'll start with the strength training piece. So the biggest thing that I think is really, really important, especially for young athletes, and particularly if they have goals to go on and play in college or beyond, is we want to establish movement competency really, really early. And what that means is strength training is a skill, get good at it. And really strength training is just loading movements that your body's gonna do anyway, positions that you're gonna get into in sport or in day-to-day life. I think a lot of young athletes, and this is partially due to pressure from coaches and whoever else may be kind of putting that on them, skip that portion and then end up in a position where they're getting, say, like weight room injuries, right? And we really don't want that. Like injuries are unavoidable. but if they're going to happen, we want them to happen in sport, not in the weight room. Like, that's silly, right?
Yeah.
The point of the weight room is to get you stronger so you are less likely to get hurt and you perform better, right?
That's a great point, yeah.
And so I think it's really important for young athletes to basically focus on the basics, become really competent at strength training, be able to get into good positions safely and without pain, and everything else will come with time. Their more sport-specific, more performance training will come along later in life. And if they are already really competent, they'll be able to be successful in that environment, as opposed to having to go back and relearn things and redo things and find ways to move without pain.
That's good.
And then in terms of nutrition, I know we talked a little bit off camera about intra-workout nutrition, right? That's been really beneficial for you, and you've kind of brought that to some of the high school age athletes around here. I think the other thing, if I could say, if nothing else, eat before and after you practice or work out.
Make sure you have those 2 meals.
Absolutely do that, particularly before. And that's something that I've seen a lot over the years in working with kind of this age range, and that was me too.
Yeah.
Where my nutrition prior to practice or competition was just not there, right?
So you pretty much ate like a breakfast, and then your training session was at 3 p.m.
Right.
And you had nothing.
Yep. And we talked a little bit about that too, how, sometimes I'll have athletes that I'll work with of that age, and I'm like, when did you last eat? And they're like, 7 a.m. And I'm like, it's 4 p.m. Like, that's why your performance is suffering.
That's so interesting. And those are easy things to do too.
Yep.
That's right. That's not hard. And it's not hard to plan for that either.
Right.
Just take a little bit of food with you before and after and eat it.
Right. And I guess I should also mention, what should those foods be? Because that's probably the next question.
Great point. Right? Yes.
So both before and after, we want a fairly carbohydrate-dense meal. And protein, of course, protein more on the after side, but on both ends. It doesn't have to be directly before. So ideally not 5 minutes before you're practicing or playing, but within a couple hours is going to be a good place. And I would say the only thing to avoid there would be not having a super fat-heavy meal directly before you practice or play or strength train.
That's going to slow you down?
Right.
Okay.
Fats are just slower to digest.
Cool. Okay, that's great. I think the audience will benefit from this for sure.
Yeah.
It's just reminding them it's not hard, and it's going to make a huge difference in your performance. Huge difference. So now you mentioned that you've worked with the youth athletes, soccer athletes as well. Can you describe your experience with the young soccer players that you've worked with?
Yeah. So my first strength and conditioning job out of college, I worked in a sports performance facility, private one down in Southern Oregon. And it was almost entirely high school athletes. So that was pretty much everybody that I worked with. I had a few adult clients and so on outside of that. Pretty evenly split, had a lot of football players, a lot of basketball players, and a good amount of soccer players as well. The thing that I noticed with the soccer players that especially differed from the football guys that I had is they weren't getting a lot of the attention to their training off the field in comparison to other sports. So their strength and conditioning was just not as present in comparison to a sport like football. And I think that's kind of it's kind of a huge mistake, because soccer players are not this other type of athlete that doesn't need strength training, right? We all need it.
Yeah, we all need it.
And so I think if anything, that's a focus that's on, coaches and parents and strength and conditioning coaches and so on, to bring awareness to we don't just train certain sports in this way. Everybody needs this.
I think you mentioned that before. The strength training is to help you prevent. You're going to become more resilient towards injuries as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Because nowadays when you watch professional soccer teams and even the national teams, they have a big portion of their trainings are inside the gym.
Right.
It's a big thing, and you see less and less the non-contact injuries decreasing within the sport.
Yeah.
Contact injuries,
that's a part of it.
Right. There's not much you can do, but the non-contact, is what we can see that through strength training will definitely decrease, minimize,
Right.
and help you throughout your career. Because an ACL tear could be devastating for especially a high school soccer player.
Yeah.
Especially a female soccer player.
Right.
They probably don't come back from that injury ever again. They probably had a beautiful future ahead of them.
Mm-hmm.
So you worked with, let's say, female and male soccer young athletes, right?
Both.
Is there any difference on their strength training, or is it an overall package for both?
I would say it's an overall package. And the reason for that is I think there's maybe some misconceptions that we need to train male and female athletes differently. There are a few, I guess, points where that might be true, but in general, the same training will benefit both of them. So that's what I tried to apply with those groups.
And how do you tailor strength programs for the young soccer players?
For sure. With that age, my primary concern, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is I want them to be good movers first, both on and off the field. So I want them to move well in the weight room, and I want them to be able to train safely and be competent in there. And I also want them to be competent getting into the positions they're going to have to get into in sport. And so the way that that's usually going to work is with a very young athlete, say they're a freshman in high school. My first priority is I want them to move well in the weight room and get them stronger, because I want to build them basically a base of strength.
I see.
Once we have a base of strength, we can train a lot of other qualities. But if that's not there at all, it's very hard to draw those other qualities out. And so yeah, basically I want them to get a lot of practice and become very proficient, get a little bit stronger, be able to withstand the stress of more dynamic types of training. And then from there, once we have that base, we have that kind of essential level of strength, which doesn't have to be necessarily, there are some standards out there amongst like the strength and conditioning community. I don't think it has to be there. But they do need to be strong enough to do the basics. And then from there, we can start training more sport-specific positions. We can train plyometrics, we can train speed, we can train all those things. I like to think of strength as kind of like the base of speed.
I see.
Yeah, it's the foundation. And then from there, we can start to really draw out those athletic qualities as they move up.
So you recommend every single soccer player, young soccer player, they should be training. They should be doing some sort of strength training.
Absolutely.
They should.
Yes.
What if those players, let's say in a high school, they just have their coaches, their soccer coaches, and they don't have the resources to have a strength and conditioning coach? What are ways that they can also take advantage of strength and conditioning training?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that responsibility is somewhat on the coaches, because if
it's good for them to hear to the coaches.
Yeah, absolutely. So as a coach in that position, say you don't have access to sending your kids off to work with someone who specializes in that field, I do believe that it is somewhat the responsibility of the coach to educate themselves, at least to a basic level, on what types of things these kids need to be doing. It doesn't need to be extremely complex, but a coach should know, for one, like what the schedule of training should look like. And so what that means is when we have a sport that's seasonal, right, like soccer, your training right before the season starts is going to look really different than your off-season training.
Right.
And so I guess to kind of flesh that out, if we have anyone in the audience who's listening who is a coach, what we want that to look like is after your athletes finish the season, they're going to be pretty beat up. We want to give them a little bit of time where they're not doing a whole lot. So they're going to have basically a little active recovery time.
Okay.
After that, we're going to have a good amount of time until we start that next season. And so that's when we do kind of our non-specific strength training. We're trying to get them stronger. We're trying to add some hypertrophy, which is just muscle growth essentially. And then at that point, we're also doing relatively high volume. And high volume just means a larger total amount of movement, larger total amount of exercise.
Okay.
As we get closer to that season,
by the way, this is a blueprint for you coaches. That's the blueprint right here.
Yep. As we get closer to that season, we're going to want to decrease that volume of weight training and make the training that they are doing in the weight room more sport specific. And that's going to work kind of in concert with an increase in the volume of practice as they get closer to competition. So they're doing more and more of their sport, less and less in the weight room. And as we get to that point where they're about to start their season, we want the intensity of their work in the weight room to be very, very high. We want the volume to be very, very low.
Got it.
And at that point, the job of the strength and conditioning coach or the coach themselves from a weight room perspective and a strength and conditioning perspective is essentially to preserve the performance that we got to right before the season started throughout the season. And so at that point, the volume needs to come way, way down. And we're just doing just enough to kind of preserve that baseline. All the other energy of those athletes should be focused on their sport.
I see. What about during season? Is there any room for strength training? Or
Yes.
There is?
Yep, for sure. But we just need to be conscious of how we do it.
Much less as well, right?
Much less. Yep. So the intensity of effort during season is going to be really, really high, but the actual volume, the amount of exercises, the reps, the sets is going to be super low. Yep. And the frequency also is going to decrease. So while in the off season, say they've just come off of their season, they've had their active recovery, we're starting that kind of general preparation block or hypertrophy block, they might be training 4 days a week. In season, it might be 2 or even 1. Maybe they do 1 strength workout per week, 1 more conditioning focused workout per week, and that's it.
That's
Other
great.
than that, it's all sport.
That's great. That's great. Now let's do a quick game here.
Yeah.
If you have your top 5 exercises
Sure.
that a young athlete should be learning or training at the gym, what would those be?
Yeah. It varies by what we call the training age of the athlete. Okay. So brand new, I think everyone should become proficient in like the basic strength training movements, which is going to be some kind of squat.
Squat.
It doesn't have to be a back squat. It could be a front squat. It could be a goblet squat. It could be any of those things.
Okay.
Some kind of hinge, which is basically a deadlift. Some kind of press, both horizontal and vertical. So that just means pushing this way, pushing that way, and some kind of upper body pull, which is going to be horizontal and vertical.
I see. That's 4.
That's 4.
4.
The last one, and this is because this is just always going to come up in some kind of, if they do end up going on to college or maybe even in high school, some competency in some Olympic lift variation, which is probably going to be like a power clean because that's the most commonly used one. And there's a lot of different variations on that. It doesn't even have to be with a barbell. It could be a dumbbell or a kettlebell clean, something like that. But the ability to competently complete that kind of movement.
You say that because by the time they get to college, they will definitely be performing those exercises.
Yes, they will have to do it, and being competent in that is just going to make that whole process so much easier.
Yeah, the transition is going to be much easier.
Yep.
Less injuries related to those movements too.
Exactly.
Yeah. Since you mentioned about the age, what is the appropriate age and readiness for strength training soccer players?
Yeah. I might be slightly biased on this, but I think as soon as possible.
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible. And
within limitations, or when you say as soon as possible, are you talking about 5-year-old kids?
So I'll give some context on that, because that might be a controversial statement.
No, this is good. This is good. We'll have a bunch of parents just like, what are you talking about? Don't tell my kid to work out. She's only 6.
For sure. So one of the biggest benefits with strength training outside of increased muscle mass and power and all that is bone density. And we get loading to the bone partially from playing soccer because we're running, right? We're impacting. But we're really only impacting the lower leg for the most part, and to some extent the upper leg. If we want a very structurally strong kid, we want to expose basically all of their skeletal system to stress. Strength training is one of the best ways to do that. I'm not suggesting that we take, say, a 9-year-old and get them under a barbell. It doesn't have to look like that. I think early strength training for kids or early structured exercise is probably going to look a lot more like play than it is like strength training.
They're still getting the benefits, though.
They're still getting the benefits, yeah. But I think if coaches can think about, okay, what's ways that we can load these kids in an appropriate manner for the age that they're at in a way that's going to be fun for them and they're going to engage with. And then that'll progress over time. So, maybe when they're super, super young, that's just, it might not even be strength training per se, or it might be body weight strength training. Do a couple goblet squats, run a few sprints, something like that. As they get a little older, you might incorporate some dumbbells, you might be doing some more like loaded, more body weight type movements, and then eventually they'll be ready for the barbell and ready for more traditional strength training. But I think it's good to start incorporating some kind of structured exercise early on.
Early on.
Because it's totally safe. You know, there's a lot of misconceptions about that. Exercise will not make kids not grow.
Stunt your growth. Yeah, I've heard that one a lot.
Yeah, I think that one's been mostly off the table for a while, but I do still hear it come up sometimes. And
Why
also,
do you think is that? Why people came up with that one? That strength training early could stunt the kids' growth?
as I understand, it has something to do with like vertical loading affecting the growth plate.
It's smashing
It's going to smash it. It turns out that's not the case. It's okay to do. And I think the other thing for parents to be aware of, this one's to you parents, is that out of all the activities that kids can do, if you look at across all the different sports and all that, strength training pretty much has the lowest injury rate. So even though it's still possible, you can still definitely hurt yourself in the weight room, that compared to dynamic sport, the injury risk is just so much lower. And so it's a very safe activity.
So for, let's say, parents, they're looking to get, they're looking to get their kids, young kids, into strength training. Should they look for a professional, or should they try to at least understand and learn themselves and coach their kids into strength training?
Yeah, that's kind of nuanced because a lot of that depends on the resources that you have available to put towards that. Best option is find somebody who's studied a lot, who that's their job, right? So find a professional. But I think it is good for parents to try to become more educated about what their kids need in that realm. For one, because they may be able to help them a little bit themselves. And secondly, because they'll have a better understanding of how to support their kids if they are in a more structured program. So both, but if you can, professional is good.
The ideal world is the parent being a professional in strength and conditioning.
Sure.
That's like, okay, my kid is going to be a beast from the get-go.
Right, that would be great.
That'll be,
yeah.
That's you in the future.
Right. Oh yeah, no, my kids will be lifting from early age.
So now moving towards the coaching aspect of
Yeah.
strength and conditioning, what are common coaching mistakes with young athletes that you see?
I think the biggest one is just too much volume. And that can come either from an actual person who is kind of solely responsible for their strength and conditioning, or it can come from coaches. But we all have limited resources, right, of energy and recovery that we can put towards different things. And with athletes, the job of the strength and conditioning coach or whoever's doing that portion for them is to support them so that they perform on the field. And sometimes that means doing less. And having a solid understanding of how to cut volume and how to manage recovery and how to just look at your kids and say, like, you guys look really tired and beat up today. Like, maybe we're going to completely alter what we were doing today in order to make sure that you're actually ready to play again on Friday. And not viewing exercise as this thing of like, oh, we just do more and more and more, and somehow our athletes get better as a result of that, because then you're just expending all those finite resources, and by the time they actually play, their performance is going to tank.
That makes sense. Let's talk about recovery then.
Yeah.
So what I've read and listened, watched, recovery is when we're getting the benefits from what we just did.
Correct.
In the weight room.
Yep.
So how often should, let's say, a soccer athlete, soccer player be training their specific sport, soccer and strength training, to give them that time in between to recover properly and be ready for the next bout of session?
Sure. It depends on the time of season. So in kind of like we were talking about earlier, if they're fresh off competition season, they've had a little bit of time to do active recovery, which is basically just moving around at a low intensity, living your life, eating, sleeping as much as you can, all that good stuff. We've got a long time until competition season comes up again. That's the time to spend a lot of time in the weight room. So that might be 3, 4, even 5 days.
Okay.
With some variance, not all those days are going to be heavy, strength training. Not all those days are going to be hard conditioning. There's going to be some variation. But as they get closer to that season, that volume in the weight room is going to come down. That volume of sport-specific practice is going to come up. So by the time they get, say they're right in that preseason time, they might be practicing 5 days a week. And they might do an auxiliary workout maybe 1 or 2 times per week, maybe 3. But yeah, I guess the answer is it depends, which is always a frustrating one, but that's the context of it.
And it all depends as well, going back to the nutrition, to sleep, that will depend as well on how much of those things that they're also paying attention to.
Yes, exactly. I think that's a really important thing. We haven't talked about sleep yet.
Because that's one of the biggest things, right?
One
when
of
it
the
comes
biggest
to recovery.
things. Yep. If not the biggest thing, honestly. Because
and how much sleep are kids getting?
Not a lot,
right,
I would assume. If I think back to myself, like certainly not enough.
Same here.
Yeah. Basically, yeah, young athletes go to bed on time if you can.
What is an adequate amount of sleep that you think they should be having?
Yeah, so at that age, I would say a minimum of 8 hours. If they can get more, that's great. It definitely does not mean that you're lazy. If you're a high school athlete and you're sleeping 10 hours, like that's great. If you can do that, like by all means.
That's when you're growing, that's when you're recovering.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's all this stuff going on at the body at that time from a developmental standpoint, from the stress of sport, the stress of strength training, like all those things. And we need that recovery time if we're going to perform well. So yeah,
that's a tough
get your sleep in.
I know, that's a tough
Yep.
one, you know, like, yeah. I really hope you're listening, watching to this and being like, you know what, let me try it out. See if that's actually going to help me out, because I know you will. We know you will. And from then they're like, yeah, this is actually what we need. We need to sleep more in order to recover.
And I guess my suggestion with that, because it's really easy to make all these statements and be like, you need to do all these things, but you know, life is busy, right? And we don't, especially when you're a kid, you're in school, you have homework, you have all that stuff going on. It's sometimes hard to get that in. But I guess my suggestion would be that if you're going to experiment with the benefits of sleeping more, try to just do it for a couple days. Try to arrange your day in such a way where maybe Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, you're able to get to bed at a reasonable time.
That's great, yeah.
Try that and just see how you feel in practice the next day. And I pretty much guarantee it'll be much better.
You'll be better. You're like,
it'll be way better.
It's similar to the training schedule that they have. Now they're having like the recovery, they sleep portion of training.
That's a
3
part
times
of
a
it
week.
too. Yeah.
No, that's good. That's good. Moving towards the conditioning side of what you do, tell us essentially speed and agility drills for young soccer players.
Yeah. I love reactive drills for speed and agility. And part of the reason for that is that soccer is a reactive sport. So we have to be able to observe what's going on. We have to be able to make a decision, and we have to be able to make our body basically align with what that decision was really, really fast.
Split second, yeah.
And so I think that reactive drills are really valuable for that reason. They're also fun. You can make them fun as a coach.
Yeah.
And this is with kind of all field sport athletes, but I love to do partner type drills for agility, lateral movement, so on. So what that might look like, one thing I've done before is something as simple as I'll just set up a couple cones, like say, you know, on either side of a field, I'll have one person be attacker, one person be defender. Person that gets the cone first wins. And I'll just have them basically track each other, give them a clap, blow a whistle, sprint. And so stuff like that is fun. It's engaging, and it also trains your brain to take external outputs, or external inputs, sorry, and turn that into an internal output really, really fast. And I think that's way more effective than a lot of kind of like traditional agility type stuff that you see done. I hate the speed ladder. I think it's silly. I don't know what it trains. Stop doing it.
That's gonna be controversial as well. We had the interview with Tyler.
Yeah.
And he went off on that too.
Okay.
He said the same thing. He stopped doing it.
Yeah.
Why is that? Because I think the idea behind of those is to increase, improve footwork.
Sure.
But Tyler explained that you're never gonna just move your feet.
He's absolutely right with that.
When you're playing soccer, it's your whole body moving towards something. What would you say on that, like stop with the ladder training?
Sure. So anytime we're selecting a movement, particularly for speed and agility, we want to think about what does this actually do? And sometimes that just gets skipped over altogether, right? And so we look at the speed ladder and we're like, okay, what it trains is your ability to move your feet back and forth really quickly while you're moving in a lateral pattern, sometimes forward, then do different stuff with them.
Right.
But you're basically training your ability of your feet to do this, which could be valuable. But that's not really how we move in sport, right?
Right.
And Tyler is absolutely right in the context that like it's not just your feet, right? It's your entire body. And so we can kind of train those qualities in a few different ways. Actually having kids run and sprint and change direction is huge because that's literally training the quality. We can also do some stuff in the weight room that's a little bit more specific to that. One of the biggest things that I try to work on with really all athletes, but I think athletes that need change of direction ability in particular, is the ability to sit their body weight into their hip. And we can train strength in that position with a lot of unilateral, so single leg lower body strength training. Get them really, really strong in that position, and then get them to the point where they can use that strength to be fast off that position.
Translate that into the field, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's also huge for injury prevention because if we can actually learn to distribute forces through places other than just our ankle or our knee, we're going to be much safer and we're going to reduce the total loading on each joint, each tendon, et cetera.
I see. So you're pretty much telling all the coaches, all the athletes should throw their ladders away.
I would say so. That might be controversial, but there's things that we can do that are probably more productive.
Good. That's good too. It's the second person that I talk to that comes up again.
Yeah.
Like, throw away your ladders.
Yeah.
It's not worth it.
We don't need them. Make people run around really fast and make them change direction, make them react.
So you see, that's the thing. You see professional players and professional teams using, ladders, and then you're like, there are better things to be done.
Yeah.
So it's tough because let's say the kids are watching those training sessions and they're like, I should be doing that.
Yeah. So I do have another point on that. So there's an interesting self-selection with professional athletes that those are generally going to be genetically elite people. Like you could throw almost anything at them and they would get stronger and faster. That's not the case for all of us, right? We're not all that person. And so if we, I'm speaking mostly about myself here, right? Like my younger self, if I wanted to get better, doing that stuff wouldn't work for me. I needed to be more intentional. I think that's the same for a lot of us, right? If we want to see the biggest increases and gains in our speed and our strength and our agility and all those things, we need to be really specific because maybe we're not able to recover like that. Maybe we're not going to make those improvements from kind of just throwing the kitchen sink at things.
Right.
And so I think it's important for, if you're a high school athlete and you're watching stuff on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, recognize that for one, a lot of those things are selected as content, not necessarily as advice, in the sense
True,
that,
that's a good point. Yeah,
right,
yeah.
things are going to get posted that look cool, and look athletic. Whether or not they actually make you a better athlete, hard to say.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be very good content to show someone this person has been squatting for a year and getting stronger at that, and they do sprints 3 times a week. That's not very exciting, but it works.
It works, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that's just important to remember that the things you see on social media or so on may not actually be what's most effective. And I guess the other point with that is that really, really good athletes who are genetically gifted are able to kind of get away with doing things like that. And so they may not even necessarily notice because they're still making improvements from it, right? Because everything works for them.
That's funny that you're saying that. I just watched an interview and I forgot his name, but he was this player that he played with Messi.
Okay.
And Messi is the best soccer player in the world by far, right? And they're comparing Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo, which is the argument, right? Which one is better?
Yeah.
I think now Messi surpassed Cristiano Ronaldo by far. And if you talk to other people, they will say, oh no, Messi was always better than Ronaldo.
Right.
But the question was, this player also played with Cristiano Ronaldo, and he's seen what Ronaldo did. And his hard work, his work ethic is like, there's no one that will ever train like he does.
Yeah.
Right? I think he's 38, 39 years old. He's playing like a 20-year-old.
Yeah.
Right? And then he asked about Messi. So does Messi work as much as Ronaldo? And he was like, no. He comes into training, he gets a massage, puts his shirt on,
Yeah.
he goes practice.
Okay.
Does he do any strength training? A little bit here and there, but he doesn't do much.
Mm-hmm.
He just plays. And he's the best soccer player in the world. And he's probably the best ever that's played the game. So it's like you said, it doesn't matter, like a guy like him, it's genetics. It doesn't matter what he does, that he's gonna still be the number one.
Yeah. And I think like there might be another thing we could draw out of that too, which is that the best way to get better at your sport is to play your sport. Mm-hmm. There is nothing you can do in the weight room that is specifically going to make you better at your sport. I think that's something that like strength coaches sometimes don't recognize enough. We'll see like sometimes people going way too far down the road of specificity. Mm-hmm. Specificity is the idea that you replicate movements in your training off the field that you would do on the field. There's a certain point where that becomes so specific that it's no longer valuable and might actually interfere with the patterns that you need to do while you're playing. Mm-hmm.
That's a good point.
Yeah, but I think that both those things. So maybe Messi has amazing genetics as a general athlete, and he spends all of his time on his sport. So those two things come together, and that makes him great.
And Ronaldo, though, like if it wasn't for his work ethic, the amount of training that he's done throughout his career, I don't think he would be able to be what he is.
Sure.
Because after Messi, it's him.
Yeah.
It has to be him. So I think that also for the kids out there, it's not just your genetics. You can also train yourself to become, one of the best,
right?
Soccer players in your high school, in your college, professionally, and so on. I think that.
Yeah, and maybe that's a situation where, Ronaldo maybe needs to get to a point where he's bringing up those general athletic qualities more in order to match his ability in the sport, right? Yeah. And so there's a lot of variation person to person, I guess is what I'm trying to say with that.
Right. Tell us, how do kids balance strength and skill development?
Yep. Kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the timing.
I see.
So we definitely want to spend some time per year where we're focused on getting that strength, because that base of strength is going to be the foundation for everything else that we do. Strength is the foundation for power and speed and all of those qualities that we want for sport. It's also the foundation of being resilient to the forces that we encounter. Mm-hmm. Really strong and resilient tissues are less likely to get hurt. Right? And so we want to put that work in, ideally at a time when a ton of sport-specific practice is not necessitated by the season, so that we can have that foundation. We can then take that foundation and then we can take it to practice and we can take it to competition, and essentially maintain that foundation, try to make it a little better every year, right? So say it's their freshman year, they get to X point of being strong, right? We then start training them a little bit more sport specifically. Their strength isn't necessarily going to increase a lot from there. We go around, we do the competition season, we come back around. Their strength is here, we try to get it to here. And then we bring those other qualities up, right? And then they play again, and they get better and better from there.
I think that's good, not just for the athletes to hear, it's also for the coaches.
Yeah.
Because I don't think if they understand that schedule, that timing for each specific training that they need to be applying to their players.
Yeah, it's less understood than you would think.
Yeah.
Because it makes sense if you think about it. Like, it's very intuitive.
Especially now that we're talking about it.
Yeah.
Like the way you're breaking everything down, it does make sense.
Yeah.
And if you plan accordingly to the year, to the season, it's actually an easy thing to plan for.
Right. Yeah, and that's the nice thing about seasonal sports is like it's all blocked out, very consistent. There are other sports where that's not the case, and that makes it really hard. We have to do other stuff. But if you've got that set schedule, like that's the way to do it.
Right. So now let's talk a little bit more about injury prevention.
Yeah.
We've been kind of talking on and off, but let's focus on that. Tell us the role of strength training in youth soccer and injury prevention?
For sure. It's extensive.
I want to hear what you had to say.
Yeah, so there's a lot of benefits that we can get out of that. We talked about bone density earlier, so that's huge, especially from an early age. We want to try to develop that. We want to apply stress to your actual bones, right? Make them thicker, stronger, more dense. We also want to make muscles bigger, muscles stronger, more resistant to tearing, and we want to make tendons adapt to stress, right? Tendons don't hypertrophy like muscles do, but we can condition them to the impacts and stresses that they're going to experience during sport, which are going to be fairly high forces at quick rates. So all those things tie together. I think with injury prevention, and I kind of want to go off on this for a second.
No, let's talk about it.
We can't prevent injuries, and I hear the term bandied around a lot, like bulletproofing. We're going to bulletproof your knees or your ankles or your shoulder or whatever. Like, that is not a thing.
Okay.
We can make tissues and joints and structures more resilient to forces and to stress, but injuries are going to happen. And that is kind of an unavoidable fact of putting ourselves in sport.
It's part of the game.
Right, that will occur. We can definitely reduce the likelihood that injury occurs, particularly if that injury would have occurred as a result of weakness or deconditioning, things like that, or poor biomechanics, poor motor control. So I guess a better way to think about that, like think about injury prevention, is we're trying to make all the structures that are going to be exposed to force really, really strong and resilient. And we're also trying to establish really good neuromuscular control. And this kind of goes back to, like, we want foundations and we want movement competency. And we want all the athletes to have really, really good neuromuscular control of their body, which is basically just your brain is able to coordinate the way your body actually moves really well. If we get all those things, we're not going to necessarily be able to prevent injuries because those happen, but we're going to be able to reduce the rate that occurs a whole lot. And the other piece to that is that when we do get hurt, if we're really, really strong, we're in really good shape, that recovery is going to be much easier, especially if there's a surgery involved, right? We're going to see some atrophy, of course, because you're going to be immobile for some period of time.
Right.
Maybe that's a week, maybe that's longer, depending on what it is. But we already have those structures. It's much, much easier for someone to come back and actually still have longevity in their career as an athlete, as opposed to just being done, you know?
Yeah, no, I can speak that to, like, I've got, again, I think I've talked about this many times in this podcast. I've torn my ACL twice, back to back, had the surgery, but again, it's what you just said. It goes back to everything that we're talking about here.
Yep.
The reason why I think I tore the first time was because of the lack of nutrition, sleep, strength training, and all. It was too much training because I came from a country that we focus more on the technical and not so much on the physical. And here in the United States, it's the opposite.
Right.
It's more the physical than the technical. So I tear my ACL. So coming back from that one was much harder than the second one because I already knew what I needed to do in order to come back. So by the time I got the second surgery, I was already prehabbing.
Yeah.
So when I get the second surgery, I get out of that surgery already up here.
Right.
It was a lot easier for me to transition and get back to playing the second time.
Yeah. So you would say you were at a very different starting point post-surgery on your second one than you were on your first.
Because I understood what you're talking about.
Good.
Yeah, it was making sure that I was strength training even prior to the prehab to the surgery. So when I got out of that second surgery, I was already much stronger than, the first one I came out of the surgery and I was already weak. That's the reason why I actually tore my ACL the first time.
That probably contributed too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess.
So and it's crazy that as we're talking, especially on the injury prevention side of things, it's all interconnected though.
Yeah.
It's the soccer specific training. It's the strength training. It's the nutrition. It's the recovery and sleep. It's all of those together. If you're taking care and paying attention of all of those points that we've talked about, your chances of getting injured will decrease significantly.
Massively.
Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think so you just mentioned the sleep and the nutrition as a part of that too. That's a huge factor with injury. And we can have injuries that occur specifically because someone is not recovered and they haven't eaten.
You see?
And a lot of that is just because you're not going to move as well when those conditions are introduced.
Right.
And so then the risk factors go up with everything else. So it's almost like all those things have to fit together and each one affects the other. So say your sleep is bad, your performance of sport is going to go down, your performance of the weight room is going to go down. Your nutrition might go down because your habits are going to change based on being in that kind of altered state.
Yes.
Same thing with your nutrition. Like you could be practicing weight training, sleeping a ton, you're not eating enough. That's also going to be a problem. Your weight training, it's either not present and you're weak, or there's way too much of it. You're not recovered and you're not performing in sport.
Yeah.
You're practicing too much. Like any of those things, they're all going to be interdependent factors. And so what we want to do is try to be diligent about all those, get them all in the right balance, and I guarantee that as an athlete, you will get better.
Yeah, and I hope that the athletes listening to this, watching, we're not telling you to do these things, right? If you actually want to become the athlete that you dreamt of, the profession, the college, if you're a high school soccer player, trying to become a college soccer player and so on, a professional soccer players, that's when we're asking you to do these things. Mm-hmm. If you want to achieve that far in your career, you're going to definitely need to take care of those things that we're talking about here in this podcast.
Absolutely.
But if you're just an average person, if you're just thinking about your high school career, again, I think, in my opinion, you still should think about your nutrition, your sleep, your recovery, your strength training as an average person, because as we grow older, we need that. But we're not forcing you to do those things.
Yeah.
We're just telling you, hey, if you want to achieve what you're saying that your dreams are, do these things. That's going to help you get there.
Yeah, they are necessary. Like it's almost impossible to get there without those things in order. And I guess the one thing I will say on that too is that with a lot of these things, I think it's easy to get in the mindset of I'm either doing all of it perfectly or I'm not doing any of it at all. And that's kind of even more general with just movement and taking care of ourselves in general, that I think that's a trap that we all fall into. 50% is better than none. 80% is great. We don't have to be perfect all the time. We just need to try to do a little bit better, every day.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's very interesting to me because the information is out there. We do need the professionals such yourself to tell us certain things, certain hacks, certain things to do, better ways of doing things, but the information is out there.
It is, yeah. That's the great thing about the internet, right?
I know.
It's all there. I think the role of professionals really is to be able to take that information, know all of it, and then translate it in ways that is actually practical for a person that is balancing all these different obligations and goals and all that.
Right. Okay, I think we talked about the myths, right, about strength training. I think they stunt your growth. Mm-hmm. That's a myth. Right, one of them.
I would say
could you address common myths besides that one about strength training for young athletes?
Yeah, I think we can kind of go back to the volume conversation, like the more is better idea. There's definitely a lot of especially sport-specific coaches that will actually ramp up conditioning as we get closer and closer to season.
They should be doing the opposite.
Yeah, ramping up in intensity is fine, but ramping it up in just total amount, like just doing more and more and more, is not productive. And I think that's kind of like an old school philosophy that we know now to not be productive, but it just keeps creeping back in, and you definitely see it crop up a lot. Got another one for you. I think there are certain sports that get a lot of attention with strength and conditioning, like American football being one of them. Sports where you think about needing a lot of muscle mass, a lot of strength and power to be competent in. Soccer is one of those where, at least in the US, there's a little bit of a different perception. And I think the average person almost perceives soccer as an aerobic sport, which it is to some extent, right? We get a lot of different energy systems. But if you look at the actual way soccer is played, we're getting into a lot more short burst, almost anaerobic qualities that we need to develop. And we also need a lot of strength to be successful. And so with that, I think there's almost a myth that soccer players get trained differently from other athletes. And while that might be true and that there might be certain qualities and movement patterns that we want to bring up, they still need to be strong. We still need muscle mass. Like all those things still need to be put on. And we also don't need to only train the lower body. We need to train the whole structure, right? If you're big and strong and fast, you're going to be a better athlete.
Yeah.
And that's
that's a
the
good
truth
point.
of it. Yeah.
Because you see soccer players out there just, although squatting is, an overall body,
Yes,
exercise.
don't stop doing squats.
Don't stop doing squats, but
don't ignore
add
all
on,
the other stuff.
add on, like I think
Yeah.
you mentioned on the top 5 exercises.
Yep.
A horizontal press, a vertical press, right? You mentioned a pull.
Absolutely.
So add those in as well.
Yeah, and I think like with that, running is also not a lower body movement. It is a full body activity.
Yeah.
We need to be able to rotate powerfully through the pelvis and through the rib cage. And part of the driver of that is your upper body, right? And your ability to have, the capacity to pull yourself and rotate properly. And so we need strength there so we can develop power there and we can be faster.
Right. So tell us tips for supporting young players in maintaining strength and conditioning routines.
Yeah. I think, are you talking from like a coach's perspective, parent's perspective, both?
Both, let's do both.
Okay, sure. From a parent's perspective, I think the biggest way that we can support our kids is trying to address their nutrition and their sleep and trying to help them make sure that they're able to get those things. And so as a parent, having understanding of like, okay, I need to make sure that my kid has access to adequate nutrition as I can, making sure that they get enough total calories throughout the day. Helping them do that. A lot of times as younger athletes, we don't always attend to that. We skip meals, things come up, we miss some of that stuff. And so I think as a parent, I know like if I was the parent of a young athlete, that would be a big priority for me, is making sure like, all right, you got food for the day, you have the things you need at the time that you need it. And also being cognizant of the fact that they're under a lot of stress, physically, emotionally, as they're growing up, it's a hard time in and of itself. They need recovery time. And so understanding like, oh, my kid is sleeping in on the weekend, like let them sleep. Let them get as much recovery as they can in, because that's going to make them a better athlete. They're going to function better as a function of that. They're not lazy for doing that.
Right? I was going to bring that up because you mentioned that earlier. You said they're not being lazy, they're recovering.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess the last thing is that like if you want to be really, really good at one thing, you have to be fully focused on that one thing. There's always going to be other obligations that we have to take care of. But as parents, like if that's your kid's dream and that's what they want to do, let them focus on that. Don't overload them with other stuff, right? Let them be all in on that. They still have to do good in school, do all the things, right? But outside of that, they don't need to be occupied at every moment, right? They need to have that downtime to recover and to sleep and to eat and all of that stuff. And so I think that's huge for parents, having an understanding of that and then being able to support their kids in those ends.
Yeah.
Coaches, I think increasing your level of education is really important.
That's a great point.
Yeah, because as a coach, you may be a great coach at coaching soccer, but we talked about how there's I think we had 4 factors there that we talked about. So sleep, nutrition, strength and conditioning, and actual sport-specific practice.
Yeah.
So you may be great at sport-specific practice and coaching athletes on how to be better at those skills. But I think it's important to have at least a cursory understanding of those other things and how all those elements fit together.
Yeah.
And if you do that, you're going to be able to look at your athletes and see when maybe one of them is underperforming that you haven't seen underperform before, something's going on. You're going to be able to identify that and say, okay, what are we doing in practice? If we're doing weight training, what are we doing there? What does that volume look like? When we're doing conditioning, how much total volume of exercise are they getting? How much sport-specific practice, so on. Okay, all that stuff is good. Maybe I should talk to this athlete. Hey, are you sleeping? Did you have something to eat today? How much water did you have today? Did you have a meal before practice? All those things, checking in. And so I think coaches don't have to be an expert in any of those things, but they need to be at least aware that those are factors that can really, really change performance.
Right.
Like day to day, if you take somebody who was performing great yesterday, you give them 4 hours of sleep and no food, and then you ask them to do the same thing the next day, they won't be able to do it.
Yeah.
And so being able to kind of explain those changes in a way that's a little bit more nuanced than, just why aren't you doing as good today as you were yesterday?
Yeah, no, great.
You need to try harder.
No, 'cause
Right?
it's not gonna matter, right?
Right.
Yeah, no, that's great for parents and coaches out there.
Yeah.
Loren, we're getting to an end
Yeah.
to the interview. We always ask this question to every single guest, and tell us a game changer moment in your life and why.
Sure. I think mine, and we'll keep it in the context of sports. I talked about being an average athlete when I was younger, and thinking about my wrestling career when I was younger and all that. And my first year was really, really hard for me. It was not good. I lost a lot of matches, had a hard time. I wasn't taking care of any of our 4 pillars, right? And I kind of like, almost at the end of that season, I kind of almost resigned myself to that. I was like, I'm just not good at this thing. And by the time that next season came around, I kind of reversed that decision. And I was like, you know what, I'm sick of this. Like, this is not gonna work for me. So what can I do? And that was really when I first started strength training, and I started paying attention to what I ate.
Yeah, that's a huge difference.
And I really started applying myself in actual sport-specific practice. And so I wasn't just going to practice, right, and doing the activities. I was like, I'm practicing this skill because I want to win and I want to be successful. I'm going to apply myself this in the same way, almost like I'm in school where I'm studying, right? I'm trying to become more and more educated. I'm trying to become more intelligent about what I'm doing. And all those factors ended up working, right? So my performance just skyrocketed as a result of that. And it wasn't any one thing. It was paying attention to all the things and disciplining myself to say, you know what, like, I'm not going to accept this from myself where I'm not paying attention to this stuff. I have to be diligent and I have to be disciplined.
You changed a few things and that changed your entire trajectory in the sport.
Yeah. And even outside of that, I think that was like, and this is a huge benefit to sports in general for kids, that is self-efficacy. You know, that's learning that skill of, if I take care of these things and I'm diligent and I'm disciplined, I can be successful. Like, I can do this thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is beautiful. This is beautiful. I think kids, because probably, like, I'm sure some people are watching this and they're like, you know what, I suck. I'm gonna quit. But no, you don't. Like, pay attention to the 4 pillars that we talked about here.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's going to completely change your trajectory.
Yep.
So I think this was great. Tell us where people can find you.
Yeah. So I am not local to Eugene anymore. I live in Bend, Oregon. I am a DPT student at Oregon State Cascades out there. I do offer coaching and training out there through Fortitude Fitness Training in Bend, Oregon, and also some remote coaching. You can find me at ltstrengthandperformance.com or on Instagram at Coach Loren.
Cool.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
I'll catch you soon. Have a good one. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please help us out. Subscribe down below and also like the video as well. I hope to catch you soon. Have a good one.